Hello everyone, my name is Thomas Burleson. I'm a senior front-end architect at SiriusXM Radio. When Dave called me a few months back and asked me to present at ng-conf, I was really excited. Then he asked me if I would present 2 topics at ng-conf, and I was even more excited. He said, well, how long do you think you need to present these 2 talks? And I said, well, for RequireJS, I need about 3 hours to present. And for the decorator talk, I need about 1.5 hours. He paused. Now I realize he was laughing his ass off. He responded a little bit later and he said, can you do it in 40 minutes? And I was a little shocked. And I said, well, I guess I could do it in 40 minutes, yeah. He comes back a little bit later and he says, I need you to do it in 20 minutes. I was just shocked. I was waiting for him to come back and say, now do it in 5. And I still would have said yes. So let's go ahead and get started. That talk that Ben gave on Browserify is actually a really interesting perspective on how to handle dependencies and how to wrap your code to use it not only within Angular but within other applications. This is another perspective on that same sort of approach or set of approaches and issues. There's some ideological differences, but I think, I think it'll be interesting for us all to compare the 2. So let's get started. So RequireJS. The first question that always comes to mind is, do you need it when you're doing AngularJS development? And once we talk about that a little bit, then we'll take a fast dive into using RequireJS, and then we'll talk about how we're going to use it with Angular. And in fact, sorry, I missed something. This is probably the #1 thing that I want everyone to try to remember. The takeaway from my presentation are these 2 bullet points. AngularJS injects instances. RequireJS injects classes or references to functions. And that's really important because there's a synergy between the 2 that you can leverage. So is RequireJS really needed? Well, one option that we could do, that a lot of us do, I've done it many times, is we can load all of our code within one JavaScript file. Here we have a flight dashboard constructor function, a queue decorator, and then we're registering some other constructor functions as services, and then we're registering our application module and our controller, and we're launching. That's reasonable for simple applications, but look at the code dependencies just for that simple application. Now, let's say I said, okay, I don't want it all in one JavaScript file. I want to organize it into packages. That's a great approach. So now I'm going to manually separate all my code into different packages. I have a flight dashboard class, a queue decorator class, a flight service, and they're in the appropriate packages, structures. But notice I have to, on line 8 through 11, I have to manually specify the order. I have to remember the dependency order of which file needs to be loaded first. And if I ever add any new classes, I'm going to have to remember to come back here and add that in. That just doesn't scale. What about larger apps? So one of the demos I'm going to show in this presentation, and I apologize in advance, I'm going to be moving very fast, but one of the demonstrations I'm showing is the Quizler app that's available on GitHub, and that application has 24 classes. Well, I certainly don't want to manage those manually. And imagine the dependency complexities that you would encounter in your own real-world applications. So what we need is a package dependency manager that helps us manage which classes need to be loaded in what order and what are the dependencies of all of those. It helps us build out a dependency tree. So before we talk about how that's working with AngularJS, let's dive into RequireJS just briefly. And it's actually not that difficult. In fact, with some of these bullet points you'll see here, you'll realize that it's very easy. Let's talk about the 4 dependency types. There's a load dependencies, so which classes need to be loaded in what order. There's a construction set of dependencies that you will encounter, which is before you can construct an instance of a class, what arguments do you need to provide to it? There's runtime dependencies. What functions and utilities do you need after post-instantiation, after instantiation that you will need to use? And then there's a special one that Angular, I believe, that I love, that provides, which is modular dependencies. One module depends on other modules. So the 4 great features that you get when using RequireJS is you get the package dependency manager, you get an injector, and this is not an instance injector like you get in Angular. This is a class injector. You get a JavaScript file loader that allows you to do lazy loading of your JavaScript classes or files, and you get a concatenator and an uglify processor. So RequireJS manages your load and runtime dependency issues, and AngularJS manages your construction and Angular module dependency issues. Already we can start to see that there's a really nice synergy between the two. So we have 3 simple APIs. The hardest one for me to try to describe, and unfortunately I have to do it quickly, is the define. But there's just 3 methods you have to remember: define, require, and config. The define and require are global ones. The define allows you to define your dependencies and register a factory function that will be called when your dependencies resolve. The require allows you to register a callback function that will be invoked when all your dependencies have resolved. And your config allows you to configure your source paths and your aliases. So the define allows you to create what's called an asynchronous module definition. Essentially, it allows you to load your files, your JavaScript files, or your classes in any order you want. But the dependencies allow it to define when the triggers get pulled. So the ready handlers are called when the dependencies resolve. And if there aren't any dependencies, then the ready handler is called immediately. The ready handler, and this is the key thing, returns a value. That could be a function, an object, a class, an instance, but it returns something that's cached in the internal registry of RequireJS. That value can be subsequently injected into other dependencies. So the thing that you have to do is you have to wrap every one of your classes in a define. Seems a little tedious. It's actually not. In fact, it becomes quite nice for the classical developers who are used to imports or linkers. And then every define needs to return a value. So here is an example of a define where the first argument is an array of dependencies, and in this case we don't have any dependencies. And this function is normally an anonymous function, but I've given it a name. It's called an onReady, and it's supposed to return some value, some function or a constructor or a string, anything you want. That value returned, as I mentioned, is stored in the registry. So here's a real-world example of wrapping a supplant function that Douglas Crockford used to talk about. It's a string formatting utility, and I wrap it in a define. So the dependencies are 0. There are no dependencies, which means that the ready handler, in this case it's just the anonymous function, gets fired immediately. Well, the code within there implements a supplant function, sets it to a string as a string method, and then returns the supplant function. That function reference is stored in the cache, and I can use it later. Now, the interesting thing is that it's stored in the cache by an ID. The ID, in this case, is implicit. So if the file name is in a package mindspace utils supplant.js, then the ID is mindspace utils supplant. Here, I've got another module definition where I've said I'm depending on the supplant function, and when it's been loaded and ready, I want you to inject a reference to that supplant function into this other handler, and it's going to return some value. And in this case, I call it XXX. Notice what's being returned is XXX, but I've injected the supplant. And what that means is I expect to use somewhere within the implementation of XXX, I expect to use the supplant function. Here's another one, and in this case, there's a little special difference. I have 2 dependencies. One is with the full package reference. Notice I'm not telling you the entire one. It's relative to the base source URL and of the MD5 crypto utilities. And then the second one is the supplant function, but notice now I'm using a utils. So there's nothing about a mindspace or anything else. This is an alias. So I can have my packages of my code any place I want and simply define an alias relative to it, and it just works. It's great. And in this case, this particular function is saying, hey, I want to use the MD5 for crypto features and a supplant, but I want to publish out a gravatar directive that's later going to be used within Angular. Notice there's nothing in here that says that this is an Angular directive. There's nothing Angular specific. So define, when you use the global define method, and that method is made available when you include the require.js script, it builds a tree of dependencies. And then when all those define methods, the handlers, fire, it builds a flat registry of values stored by those dependency IDs. And those values are usually references to classes or functions. But this is the important thing. Nothing happens until you at least make one require call. The defines just allow you to build a dependency tree, but nothing triggers until you say, I want to start the trigger. So here, I've said, I want to require the main module, or the main class. And then that actually starts a cascade of loading, because the main class, you'll see in a minute, defines other dependencies, which then have other dependencies, so it builds a whole tree. Starts the cascade, starts resolving all of them, and when they've all resolved, it makes a call back into this function here, this anonymous function, with the app reference. So the require causes a cascade. And you're going to see how this is actually really important within AngularJS apps, because if you do it this way, it's going to start making your code really clean. It doesn't matter whether you're in development mode, production mode, minified mode, nothing. Finally, we have the config method. And in this case, you have to use requirejs.config. And we're just defining locations to our sources and our packages and aliases. So that was pretty quick, but how do we use it? How do we use it with Angular? Well, again, I contend that it's actually really easy. Some people, and I think Ben might argue with or debate with me on this, is that in this case, you have to wrap all your code, all your classes in a define method call. That's not too tedious, because what you're doing is you're explicitly setting up a contract of the imports that that class requires, the dependencies that it needs. So it becomes very readable. You use the define around all your code, you set up your config, and then you use the require global method to launch your code to initialize your AngularJS app. So here, for example, is wrapping a define method call around a constructor function for a login controller. So I've injected a reference to my supplant function, and I'm not using it as part of the injected arguments for the constructor of the login controller. I'm using it later after it's been constructed. I'm using it in the body, so here in the log debug. So that becomes really powerful. I don't have to have Angular inject in the supplant function. I let require inject in a reference to the function for me. Because Angular is all about setting up constructors and letting Angular inject instances into each other. Require lets you inject references to classes or functions. Here's one for a server, so a delegate layer. This is a layer that we might have that does the actual HTTP calls and returns promises, etc. Well, here I'm injecting in some builders and a factory. And then what I'm returning out is a constructor array, as we call it, to what's called a quiz delegate. And that delegate is going to be registered later with Angular as a service. But the builders are injected here because I'm going to create instances of these builders right now that I'm going to use later via closure access within the quiz delegate. So this way, Angular never has to know anything about my quiz builder or my score builder. Here's a define wrapper around a module. So here I'm defining a quiz module that needs a delegate and two controllers. And notice I'm injecting the references to those controllers, or to those classes, and then I actually register them with Angular and let Angular do the instantiation and the injections for me. And finally, here's a wrap around my main application module, where I'm now defining that I need to have injected into there the modules that I want to use within my application. And those modules come in the same order they're listed in the array. So I have a quiz module, a route manager, and an authentication module. And I literally, then I just say, hey, Angular, create your application module, configure with a route manager. You're depending on the authentication module and the quiz module, and then Angular bootstrap. Go for it. That's all within my main.js. So we're going to see in just a few moments a demo. The source code is fully available up on GitHub, and I'll show a little bit of demo of how that code looks. Finally, but not least, the important thing about using RequireJS is you don't have to use Grunt, but if you want to deploy, how many people here actually have used Grunt? That's awesome. So one of the biggest problems you're going to encounter when you're using Grunt is how do you get required to work properly to minify and obfuscate your code. It's one thing to concatenate and everything else, but when you want to bring it all together with these RequireJS defines, it was a bit problematic. So this source code here will show you exactly how to do that. And by using Grunt scripts, you can actually deploy your application uncompressed, or you can deploy it for production mode, minified and obfuscated. So just two secrets. One is you configure your Grunt file, your JS file, to have the Grunt RequireJS plugin to have the options set up properly. And here's an example of how you might do that. The second secret is you have to configure your main launch point. So if I've minified my application code and I've deployed it, and if you look up here where it says in the head.js, what I'm doing here is I'm actually using head.js to asynchronously load a whole bunch of scripts for me. Because I don't want to use RequireJS to load my scripts. These are my library scripts that I want to load, and head.js gives me some other features for progress bars and a few other things. But when the primary library scripts are ready, then notice what I do. I say require my main class, which starts triggering the cascades of all the dependencies, then sets up Angular and starts the Angular bootstrap and does all that for me. So here was the main.js file. Remember I said it sets up the application module with an Angular, configures your route manager, or registers a route manager as part of the configuration, and then it calls your bootstrap. So let's take a look at the demo briefly. And how are we doing on time? I've been watching. 4 minutes? Okay, thank you. So if I go back to the source here, let's get out of the full mode. All right. So as I mentioned, it's all up on GitHub, including the Grunt tools, the build tools, the NPM, the package.json, the Angular code, your modules, session management, everything. And here's the application. If I refresh it, okay. So first thing I need to do is come over to here, come down to my terminal in WebStorm. Now if I refresh this, so this is running here. Let's do this. All right. So we can see that already Angular started up, it presented the UI, the logger's running, it's telling me what's happening. I even have some logging that's happening before Angular actually boots. If I go to the source where this is actually running, it's running from the bin directory where I've deployed it. But notice in this case, let me do something real quick. Shoot. All right, so cd build. So let me deploy it as a dev version. Watch what happens in the bin directory. So now in the bin directory, I have my assets just like we saw before. My vendor, this is my vendor library files. My index.html is loading a boot and then loading head.js. And the boot is actually pretty simple. The boot just says, okay, let me do this here. The boot says, hey, load my library files, and then tell require to configure RequireJS to know how to do lazy loading. So in this case, I'm doing a development deploy, and I'm not concatenating the files, and I'm telling RequireJS, hey, load these on the fly as you need them. And then I require my main. And here, I've deployed all my source. Now, we don't want to do this in production. So one of the things we can do to easily change that is we can come back here, and instead of dev, we can say deploy this now as a prod version. Again, if I open up index.html, it's got a boot. Same thing that we saw before, which is pretty cool. So my index code hasn't changed, but the boot now is a little different. The boot is no longer configuring RequireJS to do lazy loading. Why is that? Because all the code for my entire application is here in my minified, obfuscated, deployed version. And the boot just says, make sure it's loaded, use head.js to load it, and then require it, trigger off the cascade. So I hope this provides, let me go back to my slides briefly. So I hope that gives you guys some insights into how to use RequireJS with Angular. And the second topic that I was going to present was on decorators. Obviously, we don't have time to do that. That's also, the PDFs are available on the NG conference postings. And if anyone has questions on decorators or on RequireJS, contact me out in the office hours there, or contact me at any of these points here. Thank you very much.